Hello friends, Rob Caskie, proudly telling stories. Now I've always loved animals. I love the interaction between human beings and animals. Always nauseated and very, very disappointed at how poorly we often treat animals. But one feat of endurance and athleticism that has always intrigued me is the mighty Iditarod. Some of you may never have heard of the Iditarod. This is a dog sled race, or a sled dog race, that is held early in March every year in Alaska. And this race is held really in commemoration of a 1925 mercy run of serum to get serum to the isolated community of Nome on the Bering Sea when diphtheria broke out amongst that community in that year. Now Nome, as many of you know, is right up in northern Alaska on the Bering Strait and the Bering Sea. On the other side of the Bering Sea, indeed, is Russia. And when diphtheria was found to break out early in 1925, the local folk, never mind the Alaskans, the local Inuit folk, have got no natural immunity to issues like flu. Spanish flu, only 7 years earlier, had eliminated 50% of the local population, and certainly no natural resistance or immunity to diphtheria. And with the winter season, it was impossible for ships, on account of the sea ice and the pack ice, to get around from the North American seaboard up into the Bering Sea. And airplanes at that time were extremely unreliable because of open cockpits and water-cooled engines. The idea of flying, trying to get serum to Nome by aircraft, was simply out of the question. And at that time in Alaska, the mail was delivered between remote settlements and towns by sled dogs, of course handled by mushers, dog handlers as we call them. And they have largely been eliminated in Alaska by aircraft initially, and then by skidoos, and it's a real shame. And a man called Joe Reddington in the early days was determined to try and get this remarkable activity of sled dogs and the use of sled dogs back into the remote villages because of the remarkable part they played in the development of Alaska and indeed in the saving of the community of Nome in 1925. So vaccine could be brought up from Seattle by ship as far as Seward, which is the port town for Anchorage. And then from there it could be delivered inland to a place called Nenana by train. And the local hero in terms of mushers at that time was a Norwegian called Leonard Sepala, who had a remarkable lead dog called Balto. Now Balto was particularly famous for his strength, his stamina, and indeed for a sixth sense, for want of a better word, of sensing danger. Now, for those of you who think of Alaska and think of the dangers in Alaska, I'm sure that you immediately think about bears. It's interesting that for most of the mushers who run the famous Iditarod dog sled race, the big danger really is posed by moose, both cows and bulls. They will often attack a team of dogs, can easily kill dogs or injure them so badly that they can't continue with the race. And this is a grave danger for the mushers, particularly when you've got dogs in a long line, linked in teams, 6 to 8 teams, 12 to 16 dogs on a long central drag line running in pairs, because the lead dogs are quite a long way from you, alongside or behind your sled. So bears are not really the danger. It turns out to be the moose and at times the elk in that part of the world. Now, I am very interested to tell you that Leonard Sepala took it upon himself to run his dogs from Nome to a place called Nulato, and another remarkable musher at the time was going to come from Nenana with the serum that had been brought up from Seattle and brought into Nenana by train. He was going to come from Nenana to Nulato. Now, it normally takes a time of 30 days to get from Nome to Nulato. The record was 9 days. And Dr. Welsh, who was in Nome, was extremely anxious about this diphtheria taking hold and wiping out the community. And I'm intrigued to tell you that Leonard Sipala was able to do the trip from Nome to Nulato in 8 days, which really is a quite exceptional feat. Remember, the Scandinavians always said, dogs, dogs, dogs for polar travel. For those of you interested in the minutiae of these stories, you will recall that Roald Amundsen took off at the end of 1911 for the South Pole with 52 dogs, 4 sleds, 4 companions. He returned with 1 sled, 4 companions, and 7 dogs. The other 45, as their strength waned and as they ran out of steam, they were killed and consumed by the other dogs and the men on that journey. So the dogs really are an integral part of these polar histories, and I'm intrigued to tell you that the other man who was very, very instrumental in the story was a remarkable man called Clausen, and wild dog Shannon, who would be bringing the serum, which had been very carefully prepared in glass vials, then wrapped in quilting to insulate it, and all of it put into a metal canister, because the conditions on the trail that year were so brutal on account of the cold that they were afraid it would destroy the serum. And when they got to Nome with the serum, that the serum would be useless. Indeed, the serum that was already in place in Nome turned out to be outdated and worthless in terms of trying to prevent this incredible outbreak of diphtheria. There were times on the trail where the temperature was as cold as minus 62 degrees centigrade. The mushers who were carrying the serum at times would warm it up gently by fire, rest for 4 hours, and then take off again with the serum, trying to get it through to Nome. Now, what is staggering about all this is that the Iditarod, as it's run today, in the middle of the race, it's 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, from Anchorage all the way through to Nome. In the even years, they run on one route, and on the odd years, they run on another route, joining up with the main route on the Yukon all the way across to Nome. And the Iditarod has become, for many, really a seminal part of Alaskan folklore. There are remarkable stories of how the mushers today exist with their dogs moving through to Nome. So I want to give you some of the statistics and some of the facts about the Iditarod as it is today. Because it would be fair to say that Joe Reddington, who was a man whose mother left home at 6 years of age, he was born in 1917, raised by his father, and he grew up at a place called Flathorn Lake in Alaska. And he began, somebody gave him an Alaskan pup, a man who was working on the famous Alaskan Canadian highway. And he grew up to be an incredible hunter and guide. And he really was the man, Joe Reddington, who wanted to bring sled dog teams back into remote villages, and the man who developed the modern day Iditarod as we know today. And if any of you have ever done any research or reading on the Iditarod, you will have read of a famous American woman called Susan Butcher, who was to win the Iditarod 4 out of 5 years running in 86, 87, 88, and 1990. She was a woman who tragically would later die of cancer. In 1985, a moose was to attack her team and killed 2 dogs and injured another 13. And for those of you interested in the pulling of these sleds, you will know that the Alaskan system consists of a central dragline with pairs attached to that dragline, as I've mentioned. The Greenland system is where the dogs are individually attached to the front of the sled, and the lead dog has a marginally longer tow line and is ahead of the dogs who run like a fan in front of the sled. Now, there are various advantages and disadvantages to this, because the dogs are prone to fighting. They're more like wolves than domesticated dogs, known for their strength, their stamina, their tenacity, and their ability really to run and run and run. And when you have them harnessed to a sled in the Greenland system, you can end up with huge fights. All the tow lines intermingled and dogs injured or indeed killing one another. It's far better to have pairs of dogs attached to a drag line like the Alaskan system and to operate your dogs in that manner. The problem, of course, with that is that if you're on a narrow trail, for the modern day Iditarod, they clear the trail first with skidoos. So the men and the dogs have a clear trail to follow. But the trail can be very windy through forests, for example. And if you've got 8 pairs of dogs on a drag line pulling a sled, the lead dog and the sled are pretty spread out, and trying to take sharp corners and so forth becomes very difficult. You may have heard of a man called Mitch Seavey, who ran the Iditarod in a record time of 8 days and 4 hours in 2017. Now, the official name is that it's a dog sled race, no longer appropriately called that, and now call it a sled dog race. And Lance Mackay had 4 straight wins between the years 2007 and 2010, and the remarkable Rick Sundog Svensson also was able to notch up 5 victories in his time on the Iditarod. Now, on average, the Iditarod starts annually in March with 65 teams of dogs and mushers. You start with 12 to 16 dogs and you have to finish with at least 5. These dogs are very valuable. They're all microchipped. They have veterinary checkpoints along the way, and if a veterinary checkpoint deems that a dog is no longer safely able to continue with the race in terms of its physical health, the dog is withdrawn and are often sent back to a central holding point where the mushers are able to pick up their dogs at the end of the race. Now, typically they have a start to the race in Anchorage, and everyone turns out to watch the start, and they literally run their dogs only a few miles out of town. And then the dogs and the sleds and the mushers are moved to a place called Willow, where they start officially the Iditarod, because Anchorage is now quite a built-up town and city. It's not safe to have these dog teams and mushers literally careering through the city on their way to Nome, 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers away. Now, in days gone by, I was always intrigued at the athleticism of the mushers, because once a musher, the dog handler, gets onto the sled, he increases the workloads for the dogs exponentially. As a result, it slows everything down. So you will find, if you look at the footage of the mighty Iditarod, that the mushers themselves tend to be slim, incredibly athletic and fit, and that they spend much of the time running or skiing alongside of their teams, keeping their dogs on the move as fast as they can with a very, very light, hardy sled. There was once an author who wanted to enter the Iditarod and write a book about it. He wrote magnificent books about mountaineering, particularly in the Himalayas. And during the summer months, when you're training your dogs and you're wanting to exercise your dogs, what they would do is they would have a buggy on wheels that the dogs would run with to keep fit, to get the cohesion right within the team and so forth. And these dogs get so excited when they are about to start first thing in the morning that they literally are like a coiled spring. All they want to do is take off. So the sleds have an ice anchor that the musher will push into the ice or snow to hold the dogs. And when he pulls up that anchor, the dogs take off like a rocket, initially at a flat sprint until they slow down into their usual loping stride. Well, I'm intrigued to tell you that the mushers, to train the dogs, they found that the jerk on the buggy was such in summer that to loosen that jerk, they would attach some inner car tubes to the drag line, between the drag line and the buggy. And this author does the most fantastic description of often leaving the yard when he lifted his anchor like a horizontal bungee jumper, because the dogs would take off at a flat sprint, stretching out those inner tubes, until the inner tubes contracted and pulled the buggy forward with a violent jerk up towards the rear of the last two dogs. The dogs by that time have taken off again at a flat sprint, and once again the inner tubes would be stretched to breaking point and then jerk the buggy forward. And the description of leaving the yard like a horizontal bungee jumper had me in hysterics. Now the dogs, being more wolf than domestic dog, are often distracted by wildlife along the route, particularly skunks. Now we know that a skunk can exude the most violent olfactory oil and smell from a gland beneath their tails, and the dogs would often leave the trail to go after a skunk, and the skunk, of course, to defend itself, would lift its tail and spray the dogs. And it got to the point that this wonderful, wonderful writer would refer to his runs as a 1, 2, or 3 skunk run, depending on how many skunks they'd encountered on their training run. And one day he came home from a training run with his dogs, and he set them all up at their kennels, and he found that his wife had locked the back door, and she called to him through the window and said the smell of the skunks was just too much, and that night he could spend the night with his beloved dogs. So I hope that you might have the interest to go and research a little about the mighty Iditarod sled dog run each year in March in Alaska. 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers from Anchorage to Nome. And it is run in commemoration of that famous Mercy Run to get the vaccine in frigid conditions, with the sea frozen, airplane unusable on account of the conditions and the cold. Long before the advent of a skidoo, no rail lines through to Nome, when the male teams with their dogs would get that serum from Nenana all the way through to Nome and save the community of Nome. It is a quite extraordinary story. Balto, Sapala's dog, is probably one of the most famous canines in the world. There's a beautiful, beautiful statue of him in Anchorage, and another indeed in New York City. And for those of you who love dogs, I know that dogs are universally loved all over the world. You want to read and learn a little about what dogs are capable of in conditions that nothing else can cope in, and how they got diphtheria vaccine from the port of Seward all the way via railway track to Nenana, and then carried by sled dog teams through to Nome to save that community in 1925. I hope you've enjoyed this little sojourn along those frozen, icy, snowy tracks of the Klondike and the Yukon in Alaska on a sled behind a team of those incredible sled dogs. Thank you very much.